Hey everyone, welcome back to our channel. If you're new here, please subscribe. I'd really love that. If you're returning, how you doing? What we're going to be talking about today is the Great Depression and some survival wisdom that I would like to talk about. Okay, so it was the best of times, it was the worst of times, and the Great Depression of the 1930s was a time of starvation and subsistence survival for many, many families. Yet decades later, many survivors of those years hold on to the survival lessons that they learned, from hoarding pieces of aluminum foil to eating lettuce leaves with a sprinkle of sugar. So frugality meant survival. Today, most of us aren't living quite the same bare bones lifestyle of the Great Depression, and photos from that era are difficult to comprehend. In a picture of my great-grandparents, I saw a family group wearing tattered clothing, standing on a porch of a dwelling that can hardly be considered something as a sturdy house. They ate food that you and I would never pretty much touch. Yet, those people went on to ultimately live productive lives with an inner strength gained from having lived through the worst of times, the hardest of times. So here are 65 things that people did that demonstrated a great deal of survival wisdom. Families traveled to wherever the work happened to be. They stuck together as much as possible. Life insurance policies were cashed in to try to survive for just a few months longer in their normal worlds. Their normal worlds. Imagine that. If possible, homes were often refinanced in an effort to save the family residence. Clothing had to last as long as possible, and women mostly became expert seamstresses, especially at alterations. And one creative woman used fabric from the inside of a casket to sew beautiful holiday dresses for her children. In areas of the Dust Bowl, cattle were fed tumbleweed. Moms learned how to can tumbleweed to feed their families. Some had to find food wherever possible to keep from starving. During heat waves, people slept on their lawns or in the parks. Many stores allowed people to buy on credit and track the unpaid amount, and sometimes people repaid, sometimes not. And as a result, some store owners ultimately lost their businesses. And it wasn't usual for, or unusual, I should say, for people to live out of their cars and out of their trucks. And the Depression era survival wisdom is once again on the rise, both by choice and otherwise. Payment was made with eggs, fresh milk, or produce when there's no cash. The rich became a family with a cow and a garden. Those two advantages alone meant the difference between a well-fed family and one near starvation. Many Americans were too proud to accept charity or government help. It was important to maintain appearances, and individuals still had a lot of pride. And regardless of their circumstances, mothers still wanted their children to look their very best. And when the soles of shoes were wore through, pieces of rubber tires replaced them, and there was little choice but to repair them in any way possible. The Great Depression era displaced thousands and thousands of family, often grandparents, aunts, uncles, and cousins, ended up living in one house or a vehicle, as the case may be, and community was more important than ever. And the older generations, they taught the younger generations how to best survive and thrive. And desperate people would sometimes beg outside of restaurants, and yes, some could still afford a restaurant meal. Many kind-hearted farmers kept workers on the payroll as long as they possibly could, even if it meant paying them with produce. Some families ended up living in tents or lean-tos, and many became migrant farm workers, traveling from harvest to harvest just to stay alive. Anything that could be freely collected was sold. Driftwood was collected, split, and sold as firewood. Many men joined one of the government programs that were part of the New Deal. And one group, the Civil Conservation Corps, built dams and roads and campgrounds and received training in fighting fires in national forests. And banks, they closed quickly and without giving any notice. So once you never knew ahead of time when your bank would close its doors. But back in those days, society, they revered banks. It never occurred to anyone that a bank could close and their money vanished forever. Most people were willing to do any kind of work. My own relatives, they became moonshiners. My grandfather in his basement, he made his own wine. Yeah. So, these are just things that, a lot of people did. And it was okay because they lived. You know what I mean? So, just about everyone had a garden. Most gardens were enormous, since 20% of the population still lived on farms. Even those in cities still had country roots and gardening know-how. And this Depression-era survival wisdom seemed to be gaining traction again. Neighbors and family members were supportive of each other, donating meals and money whenever possible. And again, people supported, they taught, and they learned from each other. Missions were there to feed the people, but many of those missions eventually ran out of money. Everyone cooked all food from scratch. The extent of the Great Depression's effect on an individual or a family depended greatly on where they lived. Not all areas were affected the same way. Hunting and fishing fed families in major ways, and everyone, including the children, found ways to earn money. There was a team mentality here that brought everyone together for a common goal. Unfortunately, loss of income wasn't a good excuse. It was not a good enough excuse to not pay the rent, the mortgage, although some landlords in particular were willing to extend that credit. And there was virtually no sense of entitlement ever. And everyone knew they would survive if they worked hard to do so. At this time, there was no such thing as retirement. Everyone worked until they became physically unable to continue. And some towns had welfare budgets. The town loaned money to individuals, but there was a strict keeping of books. Some towns even published in their newspapers how much each person owed and expected repayment. Yeah. So there was a sense of dignity in even the lowest of jobs. One woman tells the story of Notions, the salesman, who visited their home every few months, and he looked very dapper, wore very expensive looking clothing, even as a door-to-door salesman. And the Great Depression affected people from all walks of life. Only the most elite were immune from its effects. And when the banks closed, you were left with literally only the cash in your pocket or hidden away at home. Everything else was gone. And many discovered strength through optimism. And they viewed their disadvantages as a personal challenge to overcome with, hard work. And food that would typically have not been eaten became commonplace at the kitchen table, such as bean sandwiches or codfish gravy. And many other mothers, they learned to not be hungry as they gave their husbands and their kids larger portions. And food prices at that time were pretty high when compared with wages. For example, a general laborer made $2 a day, right? The WPA paid $1 a day, but bread was 10 cents a loaf, milk 8 cents a quart, and eggs 7 cents a dozen. So meals were simpler than those we eat today, therefore cheaper. In addition, there were virtually no prepared foods at the grocery store, and families learned to shop at the last minute on a Saturday night to get the bargains on fresh produce, right? That would go bad over the weekend. So, because why? Stores closed on Sundays. Yeah. And learning to forage and find the edible plants helped many families fill their dinner plates. Things like nuts and wild asparagus were treats. And often entire families would grab a pile of gunny snacks, or gunny sacks rather, and head to the good foraging areas of the for the day. And finding free food was how a lot of families survived. Now, housewives, they were judged by how many jars they had put up and during the harvest season. And women would show off their full pantries with pride, like how we have our canning, our pressure canning. Well, that we would literally be considered royalty with how many pressure canning jars we have, with just one skill passed along from one generation to another, and from one circle of friends to another. To add different types of food to their meals, families swapped produce with each other. The seasons determined what you ate, right? And many lived without electricity or even a fridge. So therefore, they cooked and ate for only the immediate meal. And this piece of Great Depression survival wisdom meant no food waste, unlike today, right? So in some communities, there were group gardens on empty lots, which I think is brilliant. And everyone had their own small plot, and you could grow whatever they wanted. Many worked multiple part-time jobs, waking up before dawn, falling asleep long after dark, and those with just a little bit more than others found odd jobs around their homes or property to provide employment to others. And there's something called depression soup that actually existed. It contained anything and everything that you might have in the kitchen or donations from others. And to this day, some say it was the best soup that they ever had. Some enterprising women would wake up in the morning hours, prepare dozens of meals to sell to workers from their vehicles. Recycled fabric feed sacks became feed sack dresses. For some, it was an embarrassment, an obvious sign of poverty, but others wore them with pride. A family with a lot of chickens, and therefore plenty of feed sacks, might be the best dressed in the neighborhood. Hanging wet sheets over your doorways helped cool down a room or your house during the summer. Hot air cooled slightly as it passed through the damp fabric. Mud and clay, scrap pieces of wallpaper and newspapers, and tar paper covered the walls. Now, homemakers still took pride in their homes, keeping them as clean as possible, even those who lived in areas affected by the Dust Bowl. One mom made a couch from old bed springs and stuffed homemade cushions from unginned cotton. Yeah. Many spent their days walking in the streets looking for work, and anything at all that could bring in just a few dollars or a few cents for their families. Often a job was just an individual task, with payment made upon completion of that task. Then the worker went on to look for another job. Some communities organized surprise parties where everyone would pull together a large amount of food and other necessities, including cash. Then, one by one, they selected each family to be the recipient of that surprise party, which is nice. People were grateful for any kindness, any blessing, and that attitude carried many of them through the Great Depression years. And they now look back on them with fondness. We need more of this Depression-era survival wisdom today, don't you think? I think so. So, a jack of all trades could often find work with others when the others couldn't. So it paid to know a bit about plumbing, carpentry, painting, home repairs, The hardened ends of slabs of bacon sold for almost nothing. Yet, they seasoned just about everything in the kitchen. There's actually, when government inspectors of different types during the Great Depression years, they had the authority to shut down many kinds of businesses. Some did and some didn't. The Sears and Roebuck catalog, you remember those? It was truly the book of dreams for many people, not just kids. Incidents that illustrate one act of kindness after another fill stories from the Great Depression years. Despite incredible hardships, people could still find ways to encourage others with words of blessings or unexpected help. Well, I know that we all have learned from the Great Depression. because unfortunately, I think we're heading for another one. All right, guys, I'm out of here. I will see you in the next one, okay? You stay safe, you stay positive, you keep prepping, and as always, fear less. Ciao.